Did World War II ruin 1940s fashion? Over the years, we've become so used to fast fashion and social media algorithms that it's easy to forget that our clothes once reflected the world we live in. Since the dawn of humanity, fashion has been dictated by the forces around us: economics, social movements, even technology, and everything from hair to shoes to underwear has changed with the times. Few eras capture this idea as perfectly as the 1940s, which saw World War II impact nearly every aspect of our lives, including how we dressed. While men donned uniforms, or the same old clothes from the prior decade, women's fashion became a symbol of restriction and resilience, resulting in a look that was far less glamorous in the decades that came before or after it. In today's video, we'll be talking about the impact World War II had on American fashion. From the make-do mindset that ushered in a wave of DIY, to the rationing that forced us to get creative, to the workwear that finally made pants socially acceptable. Let's get into it. The American experience during the 1930s was defined by the Great Depression, but by the tail end of the decade, the US economy was finally beginning to recover, in large part because our involvement in wartime manufacturing had proved extremely profitable. With most of the fighting taking place miles away from American soil, we didn't become actively involved with World War II until it was deemed absolutely necessary. The December 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor signaled the end of this neutrality, and in a few short months, the US was on the offensive. On April 8, 1942, the American War Production Board issued General Limitation Order L-85, which introduced a series of restrictions on the clothing that could be manufactured and sold in the United States. The government hoped that by setting these regulations, they'd be able to reduce the amount of textiles used by the women's wear industry by 15%, with those materials going towards the war effort instead. L-85 promoted simplicity and practicality, with the order including exact specifications, like skirts needing to be at least 17 inches off the ground, hems and belts being no wider than 2 inches, garments having no more than one pocket, and pleats, ruffles, and hoods being outright banned. While clothing purchases were limited in the UK, the US government's ration system was focused on materials instead. With millions of men being sent overseas to fight, they needed to be clothed, and wool was reserved for their uniforms, pushing consumers towards rayon and other synthetic textiles instead. Even the tiniest bit of metal could be used to make ammunition, so zippers and metal boning were similarly done away with for clothing and undergarments. Some of the chemicals that were once used to dye clothing were now being used to make explosives, and the era was defined by military-esque colors like brown, gray, blue, and green, as well as patriotic red. American fashion designers made the most out of every inch of material they were given, but it wasn't much, so a slim and slender silhouette was promoted as the hottest trend. Menswear served as a point of inspiration, with suit sets becoming all the rage. These well-tailored pieces were appropriate for going to work or to dinner, tying into the era's emphasis on practicality. And with finances being tight and cloth being rationed, many women even took to altering the suit jackets their husbands had left behind. And these large shoulder pads eventually became a staple of early 1940s fashion as a whole. With the wartime era being so frugal, it shouldn't surprise you to hear that formal wear was less ostentatious than other time periods. An evening gown would have a similar silhouette to day wear, maybe with a bit more length if you were lucky, but where they really had fun was ornamentation. Because sequins and beads weren't rationed, they were an easy way to add some sparkle to an ensemble. And for women who weren't fabulously wealthy, a single sequin jacket could make any outfit a bit more fancy. Although the L-85 order was strictly enforced on the manufacturing end, people at home were free to do whatever they liked, which was actually what the government was hoping for. In their attempts to reduce civilian consumption, they started a propaganda campaign that positioned fashion as less important than the fight for freedom. Hundreds of programs, pamphlets, and posters were created that offered guidance on sewing, altering, and mending clothing in the hopes that the average American would simply reuse what they already had. They positioned this restraint as a patriotic sacrifice, one that had a direct impact on your fellow countrymen, in effect guilting people into buying less. Maybe we need to try that on some of the Shein shoppers. As part of this do-it-yourself mentality, knitting saw a resurgence in popularity, with millions of people taking up the pastime. While knitted hats and cardigans were worn by young women, the activity was actually promoted as a way to support the troops, with the military accepting donations of scarves, gloves, sweaters, and socks to keep them warm during the winter months. Although cotton was initially available for dressmaking, as the war went on, that was rationed as well. Because feed sacks were exempt from this, people began making clothing out of them, with companies even printing patterns on their sacks so people would be more inclined to transform them into an apron, dress, or underwear. Now, feed sack fashion wasn't exactly new, being reported as far back as the early 1800s, but in the 1940s it took on a life of its own. The practice was most common in rural America, with farmers and their wives being more likely to buy a 100-pound sack of grain than someone living in the city. By mid-1942, Japan had seized control over the majority of Southeast Asia's natural rubber, effectively depriving the United States of more than 90% of its rubber supply, which is a pretty big problem because, tires. Although a synthetic material was eventually developed, the U.S. instituted rubber rationing to ensure there was enough available for military and civilian use, with President Roosevelt asking for donations of any scraps like garden hoses, swimming caps, or erasers. Although rubber was often used for shoe soles, the limited supply at the time prioritized their use for military boots, resulting in wood and cork being used for everyday purposes. Leather was also rationed, with individuals being limited to 3 pairs of leather shoes a year in 1943, which was later reduced to 2 pairs in 1944 and 1945 because of a shortage. They were actually quite strict about these limits, with people needing to fill out an application explaining why they needed an additional pair, which of course could be rejected. Besides the quantity of rubber and leather shoes being carefully monitored and mandated by the US government, the available colors and styles were also limited to simplify the manufacturing process countrywide. To get around this, companies began making shoes out of non-rationed materials like canvas, plastic, felt, and reptile skin, which introduced more playful designs like espadrilles. The L85 order also restricted the height of heels to no more than 2 5/8 inches, but with more women working on their feet than ever before, I don't think that was a huge issue. Although flats had grown increasingly popular, heels weren't going down without a fight, and many companies took to marketing their comfortability as a selling point rather than their style. Some historians have even claimed that manufacturers were told to produce ugly shoes so people would only buy them when absolutely necessary, which I think is hilarious. France had long been considered the fashion capital of the world, but following the German occupation in May 1940, their designers were segregated from the rest of the world. No longer able to imitate Parisian haute couture, American designers had no choice but to develop their own look, which resulted in the popularization of sportswear. Being made out of non-rationed fabrics like denim and jersey, these designs were affordable and readily available, allowing people to be economical while still being stylish. These designs featured a more relaxed silhouette that was perfect for the woman on the go, and while they were more casual than the popular suit sets of the era, they weren't exactly informal either, and sportswear soon became a symbol of the new American ideal, a person who was healthy and active. With almost 1/3 of American men serving in the military between 1941 and 1945, millions of women joined the workforce to take over the jobs that they had left behind. While some women worked in offices, schools, and hospitals, others labored in factories, shipyards, and power plants. Like just about anything during World War II, the government ran a propaganda campaign encouraging women to take on these traditionally masculine roles, with the imagery found in these posters exemplifying the workwear of the time period. For women working desk jobs, they were depicted as stylish and elegant, even being called the best-dressed women of the year. Meanwhile, female laborers took to dressing like their male counterparts, just with a few feminine details that served as a form of self-expression. While a few women had begun sporting trousers in the 1920s, in the 1940s it was still a novel concept. But once pants started becoming a workplace necessity, women realized what they'd been missing out on, and they quickly became an all-out trend. While female laborers sported denim pants, overalls, and boiler suits that they didn't mind getting dirty, more tailored iterations became popular for the day-to-day, which were paired with suit jackets and blouses. Because they were frequently around dangerous machinery, women were warned against dressing too fashionably, with the government even publishing safe clothing guides to avoid accidents. One of the biggest risks was their hair, which they refused to cut short so it still looked good on their days off. To circumvent this issue, women began tying their hair back with colorful scarves, turbans, and snoods. The latter, which had gone in and out of fashion several times, also reminded women of one of the most iconic pop culture figures to emerge in the 1940s, Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind, whose dramatic story of sacrifice and hardship was one that many could relate to. Because the government couldn't ration hair, women of the wartime era got creative when it came to styling it. Volume was in fashion, and curls, waves, and rolls became a popular motif in 1940s hairstyles. At the time, no woman would have worn her hair natural, and even hairstyles that looked simple involved hours of prep, and some factories even put in salons to save people time and boost morale. With films serving as an escape from the world around them, movie stars became fashion icons. Veronica Lake became known for her signature peekaboo hairstyle, which featured an extreme side part with long waves that covered nearly half her face.
They all think they're Veronica Lake. Look!
Tying into her on-screen persona, the style was considered glamorous and sensual, making it a popular choice with women who felt like their clothing had gone in a masculine direction. However, it wasn't exactly wartime friendly, and the government eventually grew so concerned that the hairstyle's popularity would cause workplace accidents that they convinced Lake to change it. Ironically, the image change was poorly received by her fanbase, and her career saw a decline that it never fully recovered from. Another popular hairstyle was the victory roll, which got its name from a fighter pilot maneuver, because yes, even hair had to be patriotic. While the style looks a bit comical today, it was everywhere in the 1940s, and rolls of every size could be seen adorning women's heads. Betty Grable, one of the most popular pinup girls and actresses of the wartime era, was a big fan of the victory roll, to the point that it was considered her trademark right alongside her legs. Pompadours were another staple of the time period, with Rita Hayworth, Ginger Rogers, Lucille Ball, and Katharine Hepburn all sporting the style on screen. Once again focusing on volume, the pompadour involved taking straight or curled hair, teasing it, and then piling it high on top of the head. One thing that the government forgot to mention in the L85 order were hats, which became more elaborate and ornate in response to the heavy restrictions that impacted other aspects of fashion. Often worn at an angle so as to show off the fun hairstyle lurking underneath, these hats would be made in an array of shapes, colors, and materials. Turbans and snoods were the more simple of the bunch, hence their transition into workwear, but beret, pillbox, cartwheel, fedora, and puff hats added some much-needed fun to an otherwise muted ensemble. The sheer variety was because of their necessity, as hats were still considered a sign of proper etiquette, with well-brought-up ladies being expected to wear one whenever they were outdoors during the day. That wouldn't have been high on my list of priorities during a war, but I digress. For most of history, women's legs have been hidden from view, but when hemlines rose in the 1920s, they began to sport flesh-colored stockings to hide this newly exposed skin. Because of their sheerness, silk stockings were the popular choice, and they quickly became a mainstay of women's fashion. In 1939, the DuPont Chemical Company introduced a pair of stockings made out of their newly invented nylon, which was cheaper, stronger, and sheerer than other options on the market. And when they were officially released a few months later, they became a certifiable phenomenon, with 64 million pairs being sold their first year. In the months leading up to the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan began limiting their US imports, including silk. This was a pretty big problem since silk was used to make parachutes, so the remaining supply was quickly seized for military use. This wasn't enough, however, and soon after, nylon was similarly sequestered for the war effort, and women were even asked to donate their used stockings to assist with the shortage. With the L85 order instituting knee-length hemlines, women were on the hunt for hosiery, and while cotton and rayon were available for purchase, consumers didn't show much interest in them. For a moment, it looked like bare legs were going to become the next hot trend, but women of the time period weren't sold on the idea. More desperate folks turned to the stocking black market, which saw a single pair going for as much as $20. That's nearly $400 today. Some women tried staining their legs with coffee, cocoa, or gravy mix to create the illusion of a stocking, but you can understand why that didn't really take off. One of the most popular solutions was makeup, with foundation being painted on as the hose, while an eyebrow pencil made the signature seam. This ingenuity later inspired the cosmetics industry, who began releasing liquid stockings, and some department stores even had leg bars where women could get their stockings painted on by professionals. Even after the war had officially ended, the US continued to experience manufacturing shortages and struggles. This wasn't the ideal environment for innovation, and American fashion felt like it was frozen in place. Thankfully, in 1947, the industry had some new life breathed into it thanks to French designer Christian Dior. That year, he released a collection now known as the New Look, which was basically the antithesis of wartime fashion, focusing on glamour, excess, and femininity. Initial reactions to the collection were negative, with some people even calling it wasteful because of the sheer amount of fabric it used. However, American women had grown tired of the boxy jackets and short skirts that looked like military uniforms, and the New Look eventually became the defining style of the 1950s. Although the 1940s weren't necessarily the most unique time for fashion, the hardships people endured led to innovations that continue to influence today. But what actually stands out to me, more so than all of the clothing, is the idea of community. It seemed as though everyone was willing to do their part for the greater good. But nowadays, helping your neighbor is a foreign concept. I mean, just look at how people acted during COVID. 80 years ago, sacrificing a luxury like coffee or high heels was a no-brainer if it meant someone else could be a bit better off. But if you ask the same of someone today, they'd riot. We've become so accustomed to getting what we want exactly when we want it that nothing has value anymore. And as a result, we're buying way more than we actually need. I'm not saying we should go back to painting our stockings on, but maybe we don't need to buy entire outfits for a single concert or party that we're never going to wear again. What are your thoughts on 1940s fashion? I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Bye!